The Bellari HA540 Mark II is an excellent solid-state/tube hybrid amplifier. I'm a big fan of Bellari. They make excellent audio gear with fantastic build quality and stellar customer service. I previously reviewed their HA543, a solid-state amplifier that has a lot of character. I also recently reviewed the SE560, their EQ box. There's one thing you can say about Bellari. They have character, and they like their products to be different. The HA543, for example, has an EQ switch that noticeably alters the sound signature. Flat-sounding headphones that might be fine for professional use typically sound boring for casual listening. Bellari's answer to this is adding a bass and treble enhancer that can dramatically improve the boring headphone into a fun headphone. But, of course, your mileage will vary depending on your particular headphone. The SE560 is a frustration-free EQ experience. If you're looking to add some spice to your headphone sound signature, the 560 is a great little option. The HA540 Mark II is a fun hybrid amp. In my unboxing, I explained that the amp is powerful and does in fact have the tube character. Bellari uses a single 12AX7 tube by Ruby. Justin Allen at Bellari told me that the company purposefully selected their tube so that it would match the amplifier's sound signature. Evidently, Bellari bought out the stock of this particular tube. Ruby tubes are Chinese-made and are well regarded among musicians. The tubes are fairly affordable, around $15 per tube. I've had the 540 for several months and wanted to know if a tube change would alter the sound signature. I think when a company like Bellari makes a good product like the 540, it is incumbent on reviewers to put a little bit more effort into determining if the product can exceed its out-of-the-box performance. So, in this video, I will talk about tube options for the 540 and the alternative tube that I used. The Ruby tube that comes stock is pretty good. It has some tube harmonics that will hopefully become more tame the more the tube is used. Some tubes sound noisier the first dozen of hours, but eventually get better. I've had this experience many times in the past with other tubes. The Ruby has some pop and sizzle that can become apparent from time to time. It is not evident consistently, but it does happen. I have noticed that the tube settles down after about 20 minutes. This, again, is fairly typical among tubes. Once the tube has warmed up, you can expect a pretty noiseless experience. Tubes by nature add distortion and noise. If they do not, then either the tube integration is faulty or the tubes are totally useless. In order to test the stock tubes to my replacement tube, I plugged the 540 into the shit mode via the RCA. I used my HD6XX as test headphones. I played music over Amazon Music HD. The 6XX are 300 ohm headphones. The amplifier's volume knob is on mute just past 6 o'clock. It maxes out all the way around at 5 o'clock. The 6XX became very loud for me at about 8 o'clock. Turned the knob at 9 o'clock and the 6XX were far too loud, and that is what I call power. Pop songs have a smooth intimacy to them with this combo. I am a fan of the band Daughter. The primary vocalist has a clear and slightly grainy voice. She is accompanied by electric guitars, piano, and drums. The vocals sound dead center with her voice cutting through the entire mix. The vocals appear one step ahead of all the instruments. The guitars have a long reverberation that decays slowly, but does not veil the other instruments. Bass is not impactful, but thick. The separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is not particularly excellent. Yet, the bass is full and controlled. It does not overshadow the mids. There is no sibilance or harshness. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the sub-bass rumble was immediately present from the beginning of the song. It was not overwhelming or distorted. It remained in the background throughout the song. Halfway through the song, there is a crescendo with the organ playing at maximum. The organ's signature is thick and powerful, the sub-bass rumble ever more present, and the other instruments become veiled. This, of course, is not how you would experience the song on a solid-state amplifier, which would tend to separate the instrument frequencies a little better. The HA540 stock configuration on the 6XX provided an engaging experience, however. It made the music appear all around. The best way I can describe it is by saying that the 540 provided a more musical than analytical approach. When I played Pure Water by Mustard and Migos, I was rather surprised. The mids were clear and had sparkle. The bass had the effect of a good subwoofer intelligently used. The sub-bass was present, powerful, and obvious, yet it did not overwhelm the rest of the instruments. There was no distortion, harshness, or sibilance. The experience was very similar when I switched to Post Malone with Ronnie. Ronnie's voice retained its clarity and sparkle, even though the bass was elevated. The other instruments were clearly audible, and although the bass bled into the mids, Ronnie's voice carried through several steps ahead of the mix. Overall, the Ruby tube provides a thick sound signature that is consistent with good tubes. This is not the typical Chinese tube that sounds tinny or harsh. Indeed, the Ruby tube is among the best Chinese tubes I have ever heard. I, therefore, had to think carefully which alternative tube I would use. It made little sense to throw money at another Chinese tube. I did not want to get a Chinese alternative to a Chinese tube. Instead, I wanted a tube renowned for its character. I therefore bought the Telefunken ECC83 Smooth Plate tube. I bought the one branded by Fisher. This tube varies in price between $45 and $70. Mine is a genuine German-made Telefunken Fisher tube manufactured in November of 1962. I verified this by the date codes on the tube glass and the etching between the pins. In short, I was very lucky to find this tube, and at $56. There are few places you can read about this tube. What I gather is that the Fisher tube provides a fairly balanced sound signature. It is supposed to be a bit more clinical in presentation than the tube that I am currently using, which is the Ruby tube. I switched to the Telefunken. I let the tube warm up for about 10 minutes. I then repeated my test tracks. I wasn't expecting a significant change and was dubious about noticing anything but slight nuances. But boy, was I wrong. The Telefunken is indeed a leaner sounding tube. Obviously, having two HA540 units for A/B testing would be preferred, but since I had no access to that, I had to rely entirely on my notes and recollection of the Ruby tube from moments before. The Telefunken provided a noticeable difference. To some, it will be night and day. Those who are not familiar with the tube effects might say that it is a slight difference, but everyone should agree that a difference is indeed perceptible. In mountains, for example, the Telefunken combo provided a faster bass transients and less emphasis in the sub-bass. The sub-bass rumble was there, just a few steps less emphasized than it appeared on the Ruby tube. The crescendo of the song was noticeably different as well. On the Ruby, the organ sounded thick, overpowering some of the other instruments, and the bass rumble was prevalent. On the Telefunken, the organ was slightly less pronounced, the bass faster, and I could pick out more details from the other instruments. In Pure Water, the bass was faster on the Telefunken. The rumble was significantly missing on the Telefunken where it had been obvious on the Ruby. Vocals with the Telefunken were more detailed, a little leaner, and slightly less emphasized than on the Ruby. I replayed some songs from Daughter. The effect from the Telefunken was incredible. Highly processed songs like Pure Water and Post Malone are altered by the tube swapping, but less processed pop songs like those from Daughter are more affected, more influenced. Their primary vocalist in Daughter has a smoother voice than she did on the Ruby. It is a noticeable change, one that truly must be experienced. The bass, once again, is less emphasized yet still present. There is no treble harshness or peakiness. Instrument details are easier to perceive on the Telefunken. Guitar plucking is clearer. The way someone's finger graces the guitar strings has an intoxicating sound that the Ruby veiled in comparison. The Telefunken does have a tubey sound, just a different one from the Ruby, and that is a welcome change. There are not many 12AX7 headphone amplifiers, and that is a shame. Because now that I have the Telefunken, I really want to use it over and over again. I was rather impressed with the 540's original Ruby tube. It works rather well. Bellari clearly spent time and effort selecting the right tube for their amp. Could they have chosen a harmonically better tube? Probably. But to stay within the $200 budget does require some give and take. What did this test show? Well, a few things actually. First, the 540's Ruby tube does have a real tube sound. It's not the cheap Chinese tube quality that we're all used to. The Ruby does complement the 540. This is in contrast to the Loxia P20, whose tubes are, frankly, pretty bad. Second, tube swapping does in fact have a noticeable effect. Obviously, the type of tube you use will be a significant factor. If you use some cheap Chinese tubes, you may be very unhappy. And I do not advocate that you spend hundreds of dollars on tubes, but the $50 I spent on my Telefunken was not a disappointment. The third thing the test showed is that you can get excellent tube amplifier sound signature from something small like the 540. The 540 is tiny compared to OTL amps. It's a little smaller than the Loxia P20, yet the 540 is incredibly powerful. It can drive my HD6XX without breaking a sweat. I am amazed how little attention Bellari gets. Their equipment is excellent in every respect. They have great build quality, they have unique features, they are priced fairly, and Bellari has top-notch customer service. Of course, this means I'll eventually have to buy the HA540 Mark II. I have to send this amplifier back to Bellari once the head-to-head test against the P20 is done, and I can't delay that any longer. Expect the HA540 versus the P20 test in the next week.